All right, Eric, well, let's get going here.
Okay. The topic of the day is the $1 trillion forecast. You'll start to see what this means in a couple minutes as we get into the content. Why better demand planning won't free your working capital. So it's meant to be a bit of a thought-provoking statement. The white paper that I published a few weeks ago is really trying to raise awareness in kind of the senior executive stakeholder community about some of the fundamental challenges that we believe are limiting the performance of supply chains around the globe. And we'll talk about this, and I'm going to take you through some different ways of thinking about the problem statement. This is the first of a 4-part webinar series that I'm going to share with you here in a moment. We're going to couple this with 3 other events. There's a fair bit to digest in this topic. Supply chain is a massive concept, tons and tons of complexities, things like that. But what we're going to try to do is get it to a level where we can communicate some of the core challenges that are being experienced out there, some of the tactics that may be misguided in terms of how we're trying to drive improved performance, and suggest a way forward that I think you'll find quite interesting and compelling. So this is the first, this is kind of the call to action discussion, where we're just going to kind of point at and ask some fundamental questions. Why is it the way it is today? And you'll see a chart here in a moment that will kind of get right into the heart of that. That'll be followed up with a bit of a diagnostic session. So that paper is essentially complete. I'll be publishing that in the next few days, where it's going to really start to examine the efficacy of forecasting and where we may want to reconsider our approaches that we've been using for the last several decades around supply chain. Based on that, then we'll move into kind of a design discussion about, well, if we were going to challenge the assumptions and do something different, what would that look like? And we'll talk about this concept of a demand-driven operating model in that discussion and how it is different from conventional planning and how we may be able to get results from that. And then finally, we'll talk about the deployment. This is fundamentally a big change in the thinking that supply chain professionals would have to go through. It's an organizational question, and that paper is going to really challenge the role senior leaders need to play in helping migrate their company to a new way of working. So a lot to digest. We felt that it was going to be way too much for one session, so we've kind of tried to spread it out. We'll be publishing those dates here shortly as to when those follow-on sessions will be coming. There will be a corresponding position paper that comes with each of those as we go forward.
And so with that, Eric, sorry to interrupt you, just one last call out for the folks here. So over the past few years, Eric and Bernard, our European director, have published quite a few really great pieces of work and information. Those are available on the Algo Resources website. I would encourage you, again, as a takeaway today, you'll get a copy of Eric's most recent one. But if you're looking for additional research and additional information and kind of thoughts, please feel free to reach out there as well. All right. Sorry, Eric.
No worries. No worries. So let's go back. Whoops, sorry. There we go. Let's just set the stage here by thinking about some of the amazing engineering achievements that we've all witnessed over the last 30 years. Now, some of you on the call are probably weren't even born then, at the start of this horizon, but it's been, from my vantage point, I'm probably one of the more senior guys on the call here today. It's been quite an interesting 30 years. I mean, if you look back to where we were in the mid 90s to where we are today, it's just mind-boggling, the changes. And I've just called out a few examples here, like the concept of digital manufacturing. Here you see a luxury catamaran being built with a digital printing type device, a concept that even 10 years ago seemed like a dream for people to be able to do something like that. Robotic surgery is underway. We've got autonomous driving. You've got these Waymo and other companies piloting and pioneering the use of autonomous taxis, right? Which is just amazing that we now have vehicles that can safely drive their way through city environments. The first Waymo I saw was in Santa Monica. They were all over the place. A little bit more pricey than an Uber, but it's kind of a demonstration of how far the technology has advanced. My common use of SpaceX is probably the most striking. I am just totally amazed at what that company is achieving. You've got the image there of landing 2 boosters on the Falcon heavy booster concept at the same launch pad that they took off from. They're landing now these boosters every few days. They've done hundreds of them. It's kind of cool to see how soot covered they are, because they kind of represent that reusability in a very, very dramatic way. And then obviously, even in the past 6 to 8 to 12 months, just the amazing progress that LLM and AI have achieved in terms of functionality. Virtually everybody I talk to is talking about AI, right? So it's been an amazing 30 years, and I'm sure the next 30 years are going to be even more striking. And it makes this slide, sorry, my page down button isn't the way to navigate, really compelling. This is a view of data from the US Federal Reserve that shows an inventory to sales ratio over the last 30 years for US manufacturers. On this slide, you want to be lower rather than higher, because it would represent there's less inventory to achieve the same volume of sales. You can see here in the middle of the page, there were some improvements that appeared to be achieved. Honestly, those were the heady economic times that led up to the Great Recession that you see in that gray highlighted bar in the middle of the page. You can see the onset of the pandemic there in early 2020. And yet today, here we stand 30 years later, and our inventory is turning at the same rate it was 30 years ago. As they would say in the military, whiskey, tango, foxtrot. How in the world can it be this way? If I plotted the SAP revenue growth over that same period, now I love to bash SAP all the time, and their whole purpose wasn't just, to fix inventory turns, but I'll tell a little story here in a second. That growth would be from lower left way up to upper right. Amazing. And in reality, what I saw happening, and this was during my career with IBM when I was VP of operations for the consulting division, was that companies like a global tire manufacturer based in Akron, Ohio, were dealing with in the early 90s. Around the 90s timeframe, this client had kind of come to grips with the fact that with the internet exploding and becoming a commercially viable platform to help conduct business with, they were stuck in a paradigm of running their own home-developed ERP system. They had islands of automation. They were spending a massive amount on legacy software maintenance because the underlying technologies were advancing so much. They were having a challenge keeping their old code, keeping up with and taking advantage of those new technologies. What that meant, and they had Y2K problems. Some of you may not remember Y2K, but that was a big concern back in the day, that systems were not going to function after the clock turned into the new year 2000. So what did they do? Well, SAP came in to this client and said, hey, it's all on one database. We're going to maintain it for you. You can configure it to do anything you want it to do. And oh, by the way, it's Y2K compliant. So, oh my goodness, this is it. They rally around this. The business users, who were at that point very, very frustrated because they could never get any enhancements made to like supply chain or customer relationship management, things like that, thought, my goodness, we're getting this brand new software. We're going to be able to improve inventory turnover rates, service levels, all the core supply chain metrics that were important to them. Lo and behold, 3-4 years go by. They're still not live. They've spent tens of millions of dollars more than they expected to. And at the end of the day, when it finally goes live, the needle doesn't move, meaning inventory turns don't improve, service levels don't improve. Why is that? And there's some things that we'll talk about here in a minute that get after that. So it's kind of interesting. The CIO, when all of this is happening, is telling me, Eric, this isn't a business project, because he didn't understand why I was talking to the business leaders, the finance people, all this stuff. He goes, this is an IT project. What he meant by that was that They were trying to solve cost of ownership problems from an IT management standpoint more than they were trying to accelerate the business performance of the company. And I thought that was a very, very telling comment that he shared. But suffice to say, there's some reasons why this is the way it is. And I think it's time that we attack that. So, Wally, you've been through some ERP migrations yourself. You're dealing now with clients. You came out of industry. Just share a little anecdote or two about what you saw when you were migrating at Red from one ERP platform to another. Were you seeing the ERP companies coming forward with innovations, or were they just kind of following the status quo? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, for sure. I did see a couple. And interestingly enough, I think on the front end, I think the hardest departments that the ERP companies go after are typically finance. I think in my experience, what was happening is that the finance groups were getting disappointed, frustrated with reporting or numbers that they were trying to provide to the leadership groups. And the answer was, let's get a new ERP system. Let's go entertain the ERP systems. And in all of my experience in industry, supply chain was just kind of a checkbox, but we were way down on who needed to be talked to in the organization about how to run the business. It was always financially pointed, like you said, in your example there, where this is an IT issue, right? And it's funny that on the supply chain always is an afterthought, unfortunately.
Yep. Yep. And so, it was an important business decision to make, but it wasn't really pointed in the direction that maybe it should have. And as a result, the ERP companies, they were trying to capitalize on this migration of companies from their legacy environments that they developed themselves into now a package environment. So they were kind of doing what everybody else had been doing in terms of like MRP functionality, things like that. They weren't really at the purpose of trying to reinvent how to do things to get to a better result.
Yeah.
So at this point, we're going to do a little poll. So I think we've got 2 polls that we're going to issue here. We'll issue one, we'll take a look at the results, then we'll issue the follow-up one. So if you would all participate in this, we'd greatly appreciate that, because we're very interested in your feedback.
Yeah, and back to your innovation question there, Eric. Yeah, it's amazing. We just don't seem to see a lot of different ways of thinking, or is there a better way to do it? Is there a different way to do it? So excited to have you talk a little bit more about that. Yeah, a lot of stockouts.
For some reason, I can't see the full screen. I don't know, Welcome, if there's a way to show all, or like minimize the view a little bit so that we can see all of the choices there.
Yeah, I've got it on mine. The bottom one there is inventory turns are stable and or improving, so that you're not really having.
Not seeing a lot of love there. No.
No, definitely not.
Okay, it looks like we've kind of stabilized out. The big one is 47% stockouts are the bigger problem, and I couldn't agree more. The fact is that that's where you're losing revenue. You're not serving your customers well, and the like. 25% saying excess inventory, about 20% on too much of the wrong, too little of the right. And that's kind of what we call the bimodal distribution, where we've got items that are way too much stock, and then we'll have at the same time stockouts, which is obviously the top category here. And it looks like it's 4% are satisfied that their inventory is stable or improving. Okay, let's do the next poll.
Give Welcome a second there. There we go. Yeah, so what's the primary driver of your replenishment decisions? How are you triggering supply order recommendations or supply decisions? See our biggest competitor down there in the bottom, Excel. The innovation. You talk about innovation. Excel.
Yeah,
innovation.
There you go. The vital organ of all supply chains.
That's right. That's right. Mix of both. Interesting.
Very good. Very good. Okay, well, we appreciate your responses on the polls. Very, very helpful. We'll share those results in the follow-up to the webinar. So let's go back to the presentation if we can. Waiting for it to come up.
Yeah, there you go.
All right. Okay, so this is obviously not the picture we want to see. We should see a sustained progressive improvement over the decades, if nothing else. You know, obviously there's certain laws of gravity that we can only get so far down this path, but certainly we would expect to see better and better turnover improvements. So let's talk about one area that I think needs investigation, and that's conventional material requirements planning, or MRP. MRP is a concept that was codified back in the 70s, early 70s, by my old employer, IBM. A guy named Joe Orlicki wrote the book about it, where they were interested in expanding the use of computers outside of financial applications, right? And so the concept was simple. Because we know that our customers don't want to wait, you know, in other words, they want to get what they want when they want it, we need to kind of plan ahead, right? So if we could get a good forecast, then we would know all the things that we need to buy, then manufacture, then distribute to meet that demand, right? We could time phase it all based on lead times. Everything would line up just perfectly, right? So the idea is that because the customer can't wait, because we have to start things ahead of time, especially if we have longer lead time components or materials in whatever it is that we're producing, we need to start well in advance of that ultimate sale. So we load in a forecast, and it backward schedules what we're going to buy, what we're going to manufacture or assemble or produce, then package and distribute to meet the demand. Sounds very, very logical. In fact, it's so compellingly simple that, you know, it becomes a bit sticky in that regard. But it's based on a couple critical assumptions. First, that our forecast is accurate. It is incredibly dependent on this idea that the forecast is accurate, because what it's going to try to do is balance supply and demand every period forward on that horizon that we manage to. And if we ask ourselves, is that a valid assumption? Probably not, right? It also assumes that there's not going to be any variation, that every supply order we issue arrives on time and in the proper quantity, every manufacturing order we create gets completed in the proper quality, and every distribution order matches up to what the requirements are. And we know how brittle of a concept or an assumption that is as well. And the other assumption that's kind of underlying all of this is that this is the only way we can think to be able to have that material when that order comes in, right? There's no other possible way. I don't think any of these assumptions are valid. I don't believe it at all. We know the forecasts are not accurate, especially when we get down to an item level. Yes, people may say, hey, at the category where forecast accuracy is 98%, whatever, okay, you get it down to the item level, 50, 60% might be accurate, because every week or every month, depending on your planning horizon and the way you're bucketing time, you'll see that massive variations there. And if these are not absolute truths, then I think it's time that we come back to the drawing board and relook at the assumptions. Now, I am a huge fan of first principle thinking. That, I think, is Elon Musk's, secret power, or not even secret power. He talks about this quite a bit. First principle thinking says you boil every problem down to where there are no underlying assumptions. Because at that point, then, once you've boiled it all down to absolute truths, then you can start to vision and find other ways to come up with a solution. In the SpaceX concept, what that means is the following, that even though the raw materials are not that much of all the pieces that go into a booster rocket, assembling it, making it work correctly, all of that engineering, it gets quite costly. And then at the end of the day, the fuel to get to outer space is a tiny fraction of the total spend. Well, if you're trying to change the paradigm for space travel, then obviously you get really interested in figuring out how to land that rocket. right? Because if you can land that rocket, now all of a sudden you can reuse it. The cost equation changes dramatically, right? So the corollary to that would be in material planning. If we could find a way to hold enough stock that we were sure that we would always have the material available, then we could pace to the actual demands that come in, and we wouldn't have to be so reliant on a forecast that's inherently inaccurate. And I think no one has really gone back. $1 trillion of inventory in US manufacturers. What the hell? If we could free up 10% of that, it would release $100 billion that could do something more important for us than collecting dust, right? And I think this is really the call to action. Here's the opportunity to go rethink the foundation. And we don't have to look too far to see some examples that might be pretty interesting for us. Back in the 80s, Taiichi Ohno created what was called the Toyota production system. And one of the principal concepts of it was this concept of a Kanban loop. The idea was he wanted simple and visible signals. He wanted to pace the resupply of items based on actual demand. And obviously, in an automotive assembly plant, if you're using nuts and bolts, if you can use a Kanban system, then it signals based on how many nuts and bolts have been consumed when to resupply. And it becomes very easy for the users to know when to take action, right? If the bin is empty, refill the bin. You size that Kanban loop to deal with things like the rate of the demand, the Kanban quantity itself, how large the bin is, how many pieces it holds, as well as understanding how much that rate of consumption may vary. On an automotive assembly plant, it's only running at a certain speed, so there's certain upper limits as to how hard that can work. So Kanban, widely deployed. Wally, you were using this at Red. You may want to comment on its effectiveness there. It had some real strengths. It had some limitations too, and we'll talk for a minute about those. But Wally, your perspective here?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think anyone that's been around a manufacturing environment has either heard Kanban or has been part of a Kanban initiative because, like Eric mentioned, it's so common and widely accepted. And when it works, right? I think the deployment of a Kanban program, everyone's walking around giving each other high fives, look how great we are. But then unfortunately, right, without maintenance, without adaptation to use, with products going end of life, it definitely has some downfalls. And that's part of the reason I was attracted to some of the DDMRP concepts that Eric's going to talk about here in a minute. But yeah, so.
Absolutely. Lean, DDMRP are very, very effective in bringing the pull concept to life. It starts with one critical assumption that we're getting away from, and that is that the forecast is accurate, right? That is one of those flawed assumptions that we're trying to attack when we adopt a pull-based system. And so lean followers, DDMRP people, companies around the world have been gravitating at an increasing rate towards DDMRP because they're getting results. Inventory turns are improving. Service levels are improving. That was the big priority because it's doing a better job of ensuring constant availability of the required materials. There's a lot more to all of this that we'll get into in that third webinar when we start to design what the 2B model may look like. But suffice to say, there's a lot of strength in this. And if you look at our install base, and this is just a quick sample of clients, all sorts of different industries, getting great results, staying with it because it's proving itself over and over again to be a reliable mechanism. And it's helping to address some of those issues that they were facing in a much more clean, effective, and frankly, user-friendly way. So does this mean we don't need to do forecasting? And the answer is hell no. I mean, it means that we have to reposition what forecasting does for us. Forecasting, demand planning are essential activities. They are at the foundation of how you do S&OP. But the way we utilize forecasting could be changed. And if we did, it would avoid that problem it has of dealing with an inaccurate signal, and as well the noisiness that it creates in a supply chain where, because the signal changed week over week, we now need to replan. So orders that we were already expediting, maybe we're going to cancel now. That's going to drive our suppliers nuts. Or we're going to tell them now to expedite things that last week we told them we didn't need. and it creates what's commonly known as that bullwhip effect. So it's a shift in the paradigm, right? Changing the idea of how can we go from where we've been to something new that's going to give us those better results. Just like SpaceX, just like autonomous driving, just like digital printing, you have to challenge the assumptions that are holding you back and have the courage of your convictions to move in a better direction. So, can we deliver tangible and sustainable results by challenging these assumptions? I think the answer is absolutely we can do this. We've seen examples of it. There's a lot more work to be done, but there's an opportunity to move in a much more positive direction than just sitting there and accepting the status quo. The stakes are way too high. $1 trillion of inventory just in the US, in manufacturing. And if we could start to release that inventory, we could buy more production resources. We could address other fundamental challenges that we're dealing with using that working capital in a manner that's much more conducive to where we're going. We have to understand what are the core issues that need to be addressed. And that's what the next webinar and paper will be about. It's going to take a look at the forecast and how it behaves and evolves and what you need to do to understand the impact and the damage that causes, that leads then to the design decisions about what are those necessary changes that we need to make to get on a better path. At the end of the day, this represents organizational change. We've seen cases where clients had found great results in the pilot stage, but as they tried to scale out, they ran into resistance because at a plant level or at a user level, their people were reluctant to change. Maybe they felt their job was threatened. That's not the whole idea behind any of this. Or maybe they felt uncertain in learning and understanding the new ways of working. And so I think that implementing the change requires that cultural change as well in organizations. And we want to outline and cover the steps that need to be taken in that environment as well.
And Eric, if I can just add, there's a great chat going on. Again, folks, if you've got questions, that hopefully we'll have a couple minutes and we can fire off a couple questions to Eric and get his thoughts. But yeah, to the gentleman, I'm sure I'm going to butcher your name, but for Kaiway, I think what you're describing about using your forecast to do rough cut capacity reviews, not driving material necessarily or material purchases based on a forecast load, I think that resonates very well with what we at Algo believe, from a materials planning and supply order generation standpoint. So really, I appreciate you chiming in there. Great. Back to you, Eric.
Yeah, we've got one more polling question we wanted to ask. So let's do it here, and then I'll talk about the next steps and kind of where we're going to go from here. So welcome, if you would.
Yeah, and it's amazing, Eric, when you were talking about the forecast as well. I talk to people for a living, and I talk to different prospects and customers and clients, and it's amazing what people try to do with the forecast. I've heard people say that they will do a new forecast load several times in a month to drive material in that same month, right? That's their only mechanism to trigger buyers and planners. And as you can imagine on the receiving end of that, if you are a buyer or a planner, imagine how much you hate Mondays, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think too, Wally, it absolutely depends on the segment you're in, right? They all have their own challenges and conditions and things like that. One of the things you'll see if you attend the next webinar around the forecasting is even in an automotive environment where if you're a tier one supplier, you're feeding directly into an automotive assembly plant, you would think that environment's relatively stable, but we'll demonstrate how week over week that signal is jumping up and down for whatever reasons, because they don't know what their customers are buying, so it finds its way through the system. As many of us who've been in this industry for a while have learned to go with. Wow, this is quite interesting.
Yeah, interesting.
Data quality is one of those things that I think is part of it. I think the SKU proliferation is certainly part of that story. I think the volatility of demand is probably the one that I think most clients that we talk to are dealing with. There is a different competitive landscape out, that 30-year horizon, the world changed in terms of competitors, how people are attacking different markets and things like that. That leads to a lot more volatility. Clients, if you're in a B2B space, have their own other challenges. And so there's ripple effects from other aspects of their product portfolio and their supply chains that find their way back into it. So again, Wally, you had a comment there?
Yeah, another comment came in here from the chat. Yeah, Bill, I agree with you. I think as we, it's hard. Amazon has done amazing things, I think, for the world in the lead time perspective. If I'm willing to pay enough money, I could have a dirt bike at my front door in an hour, right? And I think in the business sense as well with lead times, I think customer tolerance time has absolutely gone through the floor. That we are expecting things to be here right now, whether it's in our personal life or in a business sense. And I totally agree with you that, matching those lead times with customer expectations or trying to resonates also very well with us is where can we position inventory to help satisfy that customer need and demand. So very interesting.
Great. Okay, let's kind of wrap up here. I think, Wally, we'll put up the next slide, which covers the next sessions that we have in this series. And I think it's pretty clear where we're trying to go with this. Why don't we see what other questions are out there that we ought to address?
Yeah, let's give folks just a second. Again, if you've got a question, there's a Q&A bar on the right-hand side. Really appreciate the comments from Bill and Kaiwei. If you've got something else that you'd like to ask Eric, we'll give you just a second. In the meantime, also just to plug another event, we're going to have our virtual user conference here, July 15th. So I hope to have you join. We've got some customers coming online. Eric's going to have a little bit more of an insight as well on some of the things, features, and additional information regarding Algo. So see if there's any questions. Any questions? Good, okay. Folks, just another chat. No, yeah, all good.
All right. Well, look, we tried to keep this brief. I wanted to take it a step at a time. There's a lot to this topic, as we mentioned earlier, and I think that you can kind of get an appreciation for that. The next event on the schedule here will be to diagnose, really take a look at some of those core assumptions that we've had, peel the onion back a bit and understand in more depth kind of how are they contributing to the challenges that we've got. That paper will be coming out probably early next week. And so stay tuned to the LinkedIn post, and it'll also be on the Algo website as well. Then we'll get into kind of looking at kind of a demand-driven approach, what that operating model looks like and how it changes the context of how we think about our supply chain and go forward there. And then finally, we'll get into the change management, because I do think this is a critical topic. I spoke about this at the Apex conference in Columbus last year, as well as at SAPEX over in South Africa earlier in the year. So I think there's a lot of guidance and insights that we can share on that front as well. So I think we're at our conclusion here. Thank you so much all for your attendance. Wally, thanks for all your comments. We're trying to become more agile and resilient. We'd love to be able to help you along the way, and wish you all the best and have a great day. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, everybody.